so much for joining us. Today, we're going to be discussing how to elevate executive functioning, especially for kids in K through 12, not only in the classroom, but also outside the classroom. The format's a little different today. We're going to absolutely reintroduce what executive functioning is. And today, we are going to bring a panel of experts in to help answer questions that the audience has put forth to us. So my name is Suchi. I am the co-founder and CEO of Learnfully. I have kids who are neurodiverse. I'm neurodiverse myself. So we started Learnfully 2.5 years ago, not only with the kids in mind, but also with the parents in mind, because we do have a lot on our plate and it is anxiety inducing and it is stressful until you have the answers. So, we are here to essentially help both of you or three of you, how many ever there are there, in order to help make this transition of K through 12 pretty seamless. So this is our quick agenda where we're going to be introducing executive functioning. I'll introduce you to our experts and then we'll jump right into Q&A. But before that, there's a few things that I wanted to address. So for some of you, it might be pretty simple or it might make sense, but it's funny, I just keep getting asked the same question over and over again, is that my kid has a learning difference like dyscalculia, but they don't have executive dysfunction. So what we really wanted to clarify is that typically there's a huge correlation between a learning difference and executive dysfunction. So everyone who has a learning difference have executive dysfunction, but not everyone who has executive dysfunction has a learning difference. And executive dysfunction, as you'll see, is not, it's a pretty complex concept. And it very much like autism and a few other things, it's a spectrum. It's a spectrum and then there's different flavors of it. So our hope is for you to leave with a clear understanding of what that is and how you can essentially help your kids. And here's a few things that I learned about EF as a parent that I wanted to go over. One is, executive functioning challenges, they almost always reveal themselves in the form of behaviors. Like when your kid is saying, I don't want to do this writing assignment, or I don't want to do my homework, or when you feel like they're not motivated or making excuses, it's mostly because they're learning to avoid something that they're not very good at, and they've recognized that they're not good at it. So instead of, facing the challenge, they start forming behaviors to say, I'm not going to do it. And additionally, it can't be treated in isolation. Again, I've had parents say, my kid is just disorganized. If we took an executive functioning class on organization, I think everything is going to be great. But the thing is that, much like an athlete, if something is not innate, you don't say, I'm going to go train and become an athlete, right? You're going to say, I'm actually going to start by running and I'm going to train a certain muscle group. So typically when you have, some form of executive dysfunctioning in one of the categories, the best way to do it is to practice it with the skill that you're trying to grow. Like if you have, weak motor skills and it's impacting your writing, it's better to have a strategy around writing first and then essentially generalize it over time. The next one is kids with executive dysfunction, they often get categorized as lazy or unmotivated, but it's not that they don't know what needs to get done. They just have trouble getting there. And the difference is that they just need very, very explicit instruction that essentially works for them. And that's something that, of course, varies and can be customized. Executive functioning plays a huge role in the foundation of learning. So anything, like working memory and, holding a pencil, writing, it plays a huge role in like the foundation of learning. So essentially, if they are having trouble in certain areas, you're probably going to see behaviors that may come off as them being lazy or unmotivated. So it's really important to recognize those so you can help them better in the classroom as well. And another thing is executive functioning evolves till you're 25. So this is, the last part of your brain that essentially evolves, and there's a lot of time to practice it. Doesn't mean it stops after 25, absolutely not. But the good news is that this is a skill that, a lot of us is, in fact, I think close to, we say that 20% of the learners have a learning difference, but 50% of the parents don't want to know if their kids have a learning difference. So the numbers of how many kids have executive dysfunction is a lot higher. But the good news is there's plenty of time to essentially practice that. And then the last point that, I like to make is embrace what's yours. So this is coming from my experience. It's that, when my second kid got diagnosed with ADHD, I kind of went, that sounds exactly like me. And then I kept thinking, but I overcame them, so that must be normal. So it must be normal for him too. So why can't he overcome them? But the reality is what's my normal is not the world's normal. So definitely, check in with yourself, see if, your kids are exhibiting similar behaviors that you may have had, when you were a kid. And the reason I say that this is important is because often, with my ADHD, I can have an organization problem at home, even though I've learned to do it at work. But say you have that, that kind of an issue, it is very normal for when school starts for the teacher to essentially say, here's a very structured program, I want you to follow this. And that might actually overwhelm us because I have trouble with organization myself. And I found it very helpful to go to the teacher and say, look, I actually have trouble with this. Can you work with me and help me so we can essentially set the kid up for success? So it's not a negative thing. It's not, it's just something that's different. Typically you have significant strengths and you have significant challenges. And it's really important for us to embrace them in order to then understand how to essentially work better. But enough from me. I know you guys are here for our experts. So I have Dr. Sangeeta Dey, Dr. Sheila, and Jennifer, who essentially are experts in this field. And at this point, I'm going to turn it to Dr. Sangeeta Dey to introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Sangeeta. I'm a neuropsychologist and have been practicing for 20 years, both as a clinician and as a researcher. My research has been focused more on neurodevelopmental disorders and developing novel approaches in diagnostics and therapeutics. And currently I'm working on developing social emotional skills groups for children. That's it. I'll pass on to Dr. Murphy.
All right.
Hi, I'm Sheila, Dr. Sheila Murphy. I came into education when my own children were struggling in elementary school. We're all diagnosed with ADD at the time, before ADHD, and they were also diagnosed dyslexic with an auditory processing disorder that was fairly severe. So I ended up looking at myself in the mirror and noticing, sort of like Suchi, that there were a lot of similarities in their diagnoses and in my own being as a person. So dove right in and got into the educational field specifically to support educators in supporting neurodiverse learners. And it's been my passion ever since. So as a parent, a former educator, administrator, overseeing a school, I've gotten to see the benefits of executive functioning, social emotional learning, life skills, and the role they play in supporting neurodiverse learners to find success. And it happened with my own children. And I'm happy to say that they're thriving adults because of the discovery I had. So go ahead, Jennifer.
Did you want to go over the subcategory?
Yeah. Okay, so I'd love to. So one thing that I think is so helpful to calibrate everyone's understanding around the subcategories of executive functioning. Like, what in the heck is executive functioning? It seems so complicated and yet so simple all at the same time. So the one thing that I think is really important to kind of get a grasp of is the executive functioning skills are really the control center of who we are and our minds and how we think and how we interact. And so we at Learnfully engage with 10 executive functioning skills as subcategories so that we can really pinpoint where students might be struggling. Many of them overlap. And that way we can target how we support the learner and how we can take these pieces and work them up as we're working on academic skills. So self-monitoring, working memory, these are things that we really want to be supporting in students so that they can, especially foundational reading skills, working memory is very important, self-monitoring, do I understand what I'm reading? As you're learning new skills, frustration tolerance is really important to help them develop the grit to fail and then continue to move forward and persevere. Organization, planning, prioritizing, we all know that these can be really struggle for students, but as adults, we can struggle with them also. And so this is one that oftentimes I remember as a teacher telling parents, if you would help them organize their backpack or help them organize this or get their homework together at night, and then realizing, wait a minute, if the parent has a struggle with organization, probably going to be a hard time for the kiddos as well. So again, embracing our own and working through other ways. Emotional and control, this is goes really closely with impulse control and just thinking about taking action or not taking action when something triggers us or upsets us or is too difficult for us. So both of these are really important in navigating our executive functioning. Flexible thinking also is one that can be very difficult, especially for students on the spectrum, students that just think there's one right answer for a question, very difficult for them. We also support students with task initiation, activation. Sometimes it's very difficult for students to get started on projects or long-term assignments. So how do you get them started, especially writing? They're looking at a blank piece of paper. We love to start with metacognition because thinking about what we're thinking and trying to navigate within our executive functioning skills is so important. So sort of the foundation of where we start when we start working with kiddos. Now I'll turn it over to Jennifer.
Thank you, Sheila. So I am Learnfully's educational specialist. And however, before Learnfully, I've been working over 10 years now in all sorts of educational sectors. So I've worked with newborns, daycares, public schools, intervention centers, you name it. I've been there. But lately I've been more interested in combining executive functioning with a lot of social emotional learning. We'll say that a lot, but for sure I'll say SEL. SEL stands for social emotional learning. A lot of what Sheila just explained, social emotional learning has those components with social awareness, self-awareness, and I've been very interested in embedding executive functioning with that because separately they're both very, very good skills, but together I think is a beautiful, I would say, marriage of both practical and your own emotional skills that everybody really needs. So, and actually I will touch more on what Suchi mentioned in the beginning, where she mentioned that executive dysfunction shows in behaviors. And it shows in behaviors in very different ways. And I love when you said, Suchi, that you don't treat them in isolation. What you do though, is you start very differently. So even though we don't treat them separately, where it's not just organization or self-control, we start in a very different manner. So for example, with a child that says, okay, the teacher never taught me this. You might hear this with your student, with your own child. They could have done that lesson the same day, but they said, the teacher never taught me this. A lot of that is, so if we reframe it with executive functioning language, attention and working memory. And what that means is they could actually really believe, like, no, the teacher never taught me this. And they just couldn't really remember what went on during that classroom lesson. Another example is, I forgot my homework again. So this is a student who really has trouble bringing back their homework or even bringing it back home. And they have homework every day, but they just say, I just forgot it. That it looks like a lack of structure, but really where we would start is with the organization piece a lot. But like Sheila mentioned, to even get to knowing that they have lack of structure, we start with the metacognition part first. I'll wait till the last minute to work on my project. This is visibly known as procrastination, and we'll reframe it. So if we flip it to the executive functioning, it would be planning and time management. There is time blindness there because, as Suchi mentioned, a lot of students with learning differences, especially ADHD, there's literally a thing called time blindness where 1 minute can be the same as an hour. So really the time management is a really good skill to start with a student that has issues with procrastination, or as we will reframe it, planning and time management. I hate that learning is so hard. This is the one that gets very frustrated when they're learning new things. If we reframe it, that is the child who's having issues with emotional regulation, self-control, impulse control, kind of what Sheila mentioned. You'll see that a lot as frustration. The second, this one's more common probably with teachers and even parents too, where you'll hear yourself repeating the same direction over and over and the child isn't responding. They actually could be responding. They acknowledge the fact that they hear you and they can say, okay, but then you come back 5 minutes later and they're reading a book, like in this picture. A lot of what that is, it looks like visible defiance maybe from both the parent or the teacher, but really, if we reframe it with the executive functioning, it's flexible thinking, which shows in having issues transitioning. So this is when they might really, biggest one I see, video games to anything else. Their very favorite, non-preferred, any video games to anything else I've seen, that's where the biggest transition. And that's a lot of flexible thinking where they do have a hard time moving from their very, very favorite and preferred activity to anything else, basically. And the last one is, I know this is where you see, I know I should, but I just can't. This is where they're just like, well, all motivation is out the window. If we reframe it using executive functioning language, that's a lot of task initiation too. So that's where you see a lot of the procrastinating, but also not knowing where to even start, where it gets overwhelming. And now they're just like, I give up, I'm done. So I'll actually pass it over to Suchi, but those were the behaviors associated with executive dysfunction.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. So the reason, again, we spent, quite a bit of time on this is one of my favorite saying is a well-defined problem is, half the solution. So it's really important for us to understand, executive functioning in order to then get answers. That being said, we thank you so much for your participation. We essentially took the top 9 questions that were, asked by parents and the audience. And we are going to go over them and call on our expert accordingly. So this first question is for Dr. Sangeeta Dey, which is executive functioning a new concept, and why is there a sudden increase in LD diagnosis?
Well, thanks, Suchi. Is executive functioning a new concept? I guess this issue has existed probably from the times of hunter and gatherer. Maybe somebody was planning who was going to go hunting, who did the most hunting. But anyway, so it's not a new concept. It's like, it has evolved and now we have a name. And same goes with learning disability. Kids have had LD issues for as long as kids have been there. But there is an increase in awareness. And that is why we know how to define these children, how to describe these children, and how to help them. So just as we now have a name, it does not mean that it did not exist. It goes also in different countries and cultures where they still do not have a name for it, but that does not mean that these difficulties do not exist.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. I think COVID actually has helped increase the awareness because, since my kids were home, you could see that, okay, they're struggling. They're doing something a little different here. So again, not everything needs to be, depending on, what you're going through, you may or may not have a diagnosis, but essentially learning differently is something that people are becoming more aware of. So,
Suchin, I just wanted to add that the demands of modern life is a lot. and it's very hard to keep up with everything. I know growing up, my day was much more structured than I see the kids today. Like, after school programs, AP programs, there are these tons of activities. Same goes with parents. They have so many things to take care of. So when they fall off the wagon in one area, they start blaming themselves. So I think people need to give themselves a little bit of grace, that if you forget one thing doesn't make it an executive functioning difficulty in its entirety.
That's a really good point. Thank you for pointing that out. Okay, so the next question is for Dr. Sheila Murphy. The question is, how do you know if you need to intervene or just let kids make their own mistakes? In other words, how do we know if it's an executive functioning issue versus just a phase of development that's happening naturally? Oh, you're on mute, Sheila.
That's an excellent question. So I think that, it's all about patterns of behavior. And if you see that there are patterns of behaviors going on, it's so important to get to the root of what these behaviors are and why they're happening. And so even when I work with students that aren't my own children, but as I work with students, even in the academics, I get to the root. Why is it really that they're struggling? And there's always an executive functioning skill that can be built up. So I think that it's important there are assessments out there. So you can know if there are areas that your students have an executive functioning dysfunction, and then you can find ways to intervene. I think it is important to let kids make some of their own mistakes, but if you start noticing patterns of, oh, my child's just lazy, or the teacher is saying, oh, well, they aren't doing as well as they could. If there are patterns, then there probably is some intervention that needs to take place, because children really do work hard to appease and do well for the grown-ups in their world. And so patterns of behavior, destructive behaviors are a very key sign that there is some dysfunction potentially going on.
I just wanted to add that there are always these little signs, and which Dr. Murphy, you touched upon it. The expectations are not the same from a child who's going to a kindergarten class. But the pattern of behaviors, like if they are forgetting their lunch box or their water bottle every single day, then that is something like, not like in a therapeutic way of intervention. The parent needs to pay attention to those things, because those are early signs what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really good point. Yeah, executive function, we say it, evolves to your 25, but it's there's a non-linear progression, if you will, where the bar raises in terms of what we expect from you. Like, the same thing is not expected, or rather we expect more from a fifth grader than we do from a kindergartner. And so that's a really good point, that some of them may have to do with that. Yeah. All right. Next question I have for Jennifer from our audience is, my child has a learning difference and or struggles with executive functioning. What should I be telling the school and the classroom teacher?
I like this one, and I'll take it to the direction of both if your child has an IEP and doesn't have an IEP, because with IEP, there's a way where you can actually have executive functioning skills be part of the goal. So working with the teacher, a lot of the times, if you're your child's biggest advocate, if you have learned everything about their learning difference and it is executive functioning, and the teacher, a lot of the times it's not that the teachers don't know, it's that they are not aware that that's what they're already doing. So a teacher actually already knows that they're organizing, they are activating metacognition in a child, but it's not labeled as executive functioning. So be your child's biggest advocate and even talk to the teacher about, okay, these are some executive functioning skills that you might be doing. My favorite thing is collaborate, co-construct with the classroom teacher. If they are not knowledgeable in executive functioning, that's where the parent advocate would come in and really help inform the teacher with that. And you'll find out the teacher probably doesn't even mean it. It's just sometimes a lot of schooling, and being from a classroom myself, we do have a structure, but now looking at it from an executive functioning lens, we were doing a lot of organization. We were doing a lot of planning with students. It just wasn't explicitly taught. So I would say with an IEP, you can definitely still incorporate executive functioning goals in there without one. Be the parent, be the advocate for your teacher, for the child, and help even inform the teacher too, because sometimes they might not even know or even have the resources themselves.
I would agree with that. I think as a parent, what was really helpful is, just again, borrowing from my experiences, I would hear feedback like, oh, your kid's not reading at grade level. Or this one example I like to use is in kindergarten, the teacher would say, oh, your kid doesn't know his ABCs. And, it's such a general statement. And often as parents, it's really hard to understand what that means. And what was most helpful was saying, hey, can I come volunteer during this time? When does this happen? Like, I want to actually see this because he does his ABCs at home. And that's when I was able to determine that actually the classroom was loud. It was an auditory processing issue, but writing down the instructions and then just kind of pointing to it really helped. I can't say I did it on my own. I definitely had help. Like I was able to talk to an education specialist and explain the situation. And then they were able to come up with some simple accommodations for the kids that then made things a lot easier. So for sure, no one here is expecting you to start advocating for them right away. Definitely look for a specialist that a teacher, IEPs aside, that a teacher is willing to collaborate with, in some simple form. Okay, great. Next question. Again, it's for Dr. Sangeeta Dey, which is, don't kids naturally evolve and develop their own EF skills? Like, is this something that we should really interfere with? Oh, you're on mute.
The one thing that is important, most important thing to clarify is that people think of executive functioning as a single construct. Even though it's one term, it is used to describe a set of skills, which varies from working memory to goal selection, planning and organization, self-monitoring. The important thing to understand is that not all of these skills develop at the same rate. And there are different windows of growth or windows of opportunities to kind of develop them. So the expectation is, what the expectation you would have from an elementary school child is not something you would have from a middle schooler or a high schooler. So they do change a little bit, but there's also they develop it at their own pace. And we have to give them the room to do that. At the same time, if there are environmental factors already embedded, such as stress and family structure, educational opportunities, that has a huge impact on how these skills would develop. So even smallest things we don't give much attention to it. If there has been a divorce in the family or, early sensory deprivation, all those things can impact. I mean, a child can be born to have normal executive functioning skills, but they may not develop at the expected pace because of these environmental issues. So that is where the intervention, the right intervention, early recognition comes into play. I saw somebody actually send a very good question, which I wanted to tie it in here. What are some assessments that are widely used to assess executive functioning in children and adolescents? And I'll tell you what, there is no assessment. Yes, there are a lot of tests, this test, that test, but the behavioral observation, the qualitative history, the data that we ask the parents and the teachers that we get from is the best assessment tool for executive functioning skills. And I'm sure, a lot of we can have these children sit in our room in a one-on-one distraction-free environment and give them the most complex math to solve in their head, and they do very well. Does that mean that their executive functional skills are intact? No, it just means that they are really good in working on these problems when they are in the right environment. So if you want to ask me, like, what is a good assessment tool, it's the behavioral observations and qualitative history. That's the best tool. For me in my office, the assessment for executive functioning starts once the kid steps out of their car in the parking lot. How long it takes them to separate from their parents, how well they transition, what do they do in their breaks, can they play? So all of these, come. And to answer your question, do they naturally evolve? Obviously, brain maturation has a lot of, an important part to play in it. But just thinking like, things would be all right when the kid, I mean, if a child is not able to complete their homework when they're 6, they are not going to be able to complete it when they're 8 or 10 or 16, or even when they go to college. So the right intervention have to start.
That was, I completely agree with that. I like that answer. Thank you for that. Next one is for Dr. Sheila Murphy. So it's actually kind of complementary. How do we improve these executive functioning skills in kids?
So practice, I think, is one of the best ways. One of the things that I see as a common challenge is that this learned helplessness that's happened. Parents are overcompensating for kids in some ways, and then the kids haven't had that struggle, haven't had to develop grit or perseverance. They don't think about their thinking because somebody's always there to clean up the mess after them. And so improving these executive functioning skills really starts with knowing what they are and thinking about, what's developmentally appropriate, and then, encouraging these things in your child to stretch their thinking, their thinking in academics, not workbooks, not harder problems, but letting them have some productive struggles, challenging them with things that maybe take them outside of their comfort zone. And then, clearly there are executive functioning dysfunctions that may not, be remedied this way, but practicing the executive functioning skills within an environment where they're given scaffolds and tools and resources to support working memory or organization or any of these skills that they might, time management, be lacking in, and that practice over time. But the biggest thing I can say is that you don't do them all at once. Practice one at a time in a meaningful way, and then move forward, kind of measuring incremental successes, understanding where they could or should be at a certain point in their lives.
Awesome. There is one question that I would like to address that has come in live. I think this is an extremely important question because often cognition, executive functioning, there's a lot of mixing of the terms. So Dr. Sangeeta Dey, the question is, cognitive testing has helped, develop an effective IEP for my grandson. So I'm guessing this has to do with, our previous question. We talk about this often in terms of the differences, and I would really like for you to get into that.
So cognitive testing can mean a lot of different things depending on the clinician you go to. I mean, it could just be an IQ test, which does not actually provide much information. But if this means like a comprehensive test that includes batteries for academics, cognitive processing, memory, attention, everything, then of course, that gives you a profile of strengths and weaknesses that also clarify any diagnostic issues, because you cannot, first of all, executive functioning, they do not happen in isolation. They are almost always like a package deal with something else tied in. Mm-hmm. Not, I would say, all the time, but I would say 95% of the time. I barely see any child who only has executive functioning problems in isolation. So these testing actually clarify the extent of, what are the other areas that this child needs help with and how that could be tied into executive functioning. So a comprehensive test will kind of clarify diagnostic questions like if it's an ADHD, any learning issue, any attentional difficulties, any processing, fine motor issues, and how executive functioning can be used as a foundation to build upon all those skills. So absolutely, a thorough testing is really helpful in clarifying. Otherwise, you're only treating the symptom. You do not know what is causing those symptoms.
Yeah. And to also further clarify, I guess this was also tacked on to, are there any specific tests? And I think the answer is there isn't one specific test. There's qualitative, there's quantitative. And of course, this has to be done by a professional. You know, it's like you can't go on a website and like self-diagnose. You can guess, but, you know, it's definitely better to, you know, seek a professional's advice so they can, you know, bring out the right tests, both qualitative and quantitative. So thank you for that. The next one is, again, similar. How do I know if my child is being lazy or if they truly have executive functioning problems? I do want to tack on another one over here, which says that can a child learn the skill and then regress? Like, is that an executive functioning issue? So Jennifer, I'll let you, you know, take that away.
Yes, I think that was a great, I think it was like a question and a comment at the same time. So can they learn the skill and then regress? I would say yes, because it's a habit building. So since it's a skill, it is something that you learn and continuously practice. It's the same as if I'm trying to learn to play the piano. It's not going to come as naturally. It is a brand new skill, maybe even if it's for example, if they're just learning task initiation, for example, like how can I start an activity? There's a lot of things that happen before even just the starting. It's not as simple as I'm just going to grab my paper and pencil, and I'm just going to write this 10-page essay. No, it goes with, okay, I know a lot of 10-page essays overwhelm me. How can I break it down? Then, like Sangeeta said, a lot of it coincides with planning, organization. So it will happen naturally where there will be, and it's just with any habit, right? So there's like, I forgot where I read this, but it's a level of almost like a plateau, where as you're learning the skill, you will see a little bit of progress, and then there will be a plateau where it's like normal habit building. It's a skill, brand new skill that they're learning. So I think and it's not necessarily that they'll regress, but it's just, okay, maybe in that regression, something happened that is different. So if we're working on organization and there's a regression in that organization, something else could be it that we will need to tackle. So I think the biggest point is that, yes, there will be, but also at the same time, that shows something else in the picture with executive function.
Quickly, if it's okay, I remember reading this question, but I think and Jennifer actually hit all the key points. I remember there were two parts to this question. One was about the child having difficulty, really the most concrete aspects of executive functioning. And the second was the regression piece. Is that correct, Suchi?
That is correct. You would be right about that.
Yeah. So I'm just curious if this child have had any thorough evaluation done, because that would clarify, like, why is this child having some learning difficulty with the concrete? And, you know, the level of concreteness also is very relative. What's concrete for me may not be concrete enough for the child. So maybe we have to further break things down. Maybe there is a learning issue that's impacting the child's ability to understand. But I really believe in, like, you know, what Newton has said, like, you know, if a fish's intellectual skills are judged by their ability to climb the tree, they would spend their life thinking they're stupid. So I just wanted to make sure, like, you know, just because a child may not be able to understand certain things that are defined as concrete, it may be that they need just a different way of teaching those skills. About the term regression, I'm always very careful how I use that term, because regression is something that has a lot of pathological indication, in the sense, like, you know, it's like in autism, like, you know, a child is regressing, they're losing certain skills. So I'm assuming that is not what we are talking about here. But here, regression likely means that this is a child who needs continued services all through the year. Like, it's not like, you know, because it's summer, they can go on vacation and not practice any of those skills. So when we see problems like that, I just tell that teaching these skills are going to be a part of the child's life, whether they are on vacation, whether it's a weekend. You just kind of fit it in their lifestyle. So they are practicing it in some way, one way or the other.
I agree
I
with
like
that.
that.
I think my thought was it was very loaded because often the word regression, at least when my kid was growing up, was used very loosely in the school, but very gingerly on the medical side. So, and then we tend to associate it with the medical side. And then they were like, oh, kids regressing, behaviors are getting worse. Turns out he was just bored. I just got someone and he was acting up because he wanted attention. And so they labeled it a regression. So that, I think, as a parent is a very scary word. So again, assuming that, obviously it's not something more serious. I completely agree with what you said. Sorry, Jennifer, were you going to say something?
Oh, yeah, I was just going to touch on Sangeeta's point of it could be more of the environment where it's the summer and it's going to be continued services even through the fall because they're just naturally going through these very big changes environmentally. It's not going to look the same. They might, in the summer, everything's very loose, everything's fun, but then they start going back in the fall. Then you get the holidays. So it's like this natural, and I would agree too with the word like regression. It's this natural, I would say, season of even how you would see the skills develop. And it naturally happens. And again, I really like the point of just realistic. I know around this time, it's around March, April. I know for a lot of students, this is when naturally, because being as a teacher, come springtime, we're waiting for the summer. And that happens with the students too. So there, right now, you will see, well, I would say a regression, maybe a dip in what they were naturally progressing as. But it happens, it's overall, look at the season around this time, March, April, springtime, they are getting very exhausted. Maybe they're planning for testing. So there are other factors that play into that dip.
Great. Sadly, we only have time for one more question. This is for Dr. Sangeeta Dey. I'm going to mix a couple of things in here because there was a good question there. How does executive functioning affect social skills and speech?
Oh, I'm sorry. Actually, I lost the audio for 1 minute. Can you repeat that, Suchi?
No problem. So I'm actually combining, because we only have time for one more question, I'm combining, one very good question from the audience, which is, what does executive functioning have to do with social skills? Meaning, how does it impact it? And how does it impact speech as well?
Okay, so let me answer the first part because it's right in front of me. The question, okay, sorry, I'm actually having some problems with audio.
Okay, we can hear you.
As long as you can hear me, I'll just keep talking.
Yeah.
Okay, so executive functioning are actually tied with a lot of skills, such as impulse control, tantrums, difficulty in self-regulating emotions. So from a skills perspective, there is a bit of overlap with executive functioning skills, but also you have to look at it from a brain perspective. So, our frontal lobes of our brain are tied to the executive functioning. And any deficit, any reduced inefficiency in that part of the brain is actually associated with, some of those social skills and personality changes that we see. We are not talking about organic brain damage here. But it's very common for children who have executive functioning difficulties to also have social skills difficulties because they are the ability to navigate social situations is also tied with the planning and organization and being able to read the nonverbal cues in the environment. They all are just very closely tied. And one thing I do want to clarify that these children actually do want to be social, when they are in the right situation, if they love Minecraft, maybe they are with a friend, it goes really, really well. It's just when the disagreements happen, that's when they have difficulty navigating, and how to kind of come to a point where we can agree to it. So that was tied to the social skills. You really cannot separate both of them. Executive functioning, they are just flow through you in every aspect of life, and social skills are no different. The second piece is the speech. It does not, if your child has speech difficulties, let's be honest, he has speech and language issues. But if this is the child is speaks really clearly, very well when they are in control of the conversation, then probably there is something else going on. If this is a child who comes home from school and you ask them, hey, what happened at school? And they just nudge, saying, I don't know. That means they're trying to avoid a conversation, which means like communication is a bit harder for them. And why is that? Because the fluid formulation of language requires some degree of planning. Like, how do you put the words together? Think about the grammar structure. That's a lot of work for a child with executive functioning. It's much easier to say, I don't know, or I forget. So, so that is all I can think of in the limited time we have.
No problem. That was perfect. So we apologize. There's more questions, but we can get to it. But hey, we're around. Like I said, a problem that's well defined is half the solution. So if you want to learn about your kid's EF profile, please feel free to scan or visit that. Additionally, Dr. Sangeeta Dey is a neuropsychologist and teaches at Stanford, but she also has her own social skills company called My Semantics Lab, and we are forming social skills group. And don't think of social skills group as just how do they play together. There's a lot of life skills that are associated with this, like improv classes and stuff like that. This is to help challenge some of those high schools and high schoolers or teens to beef up their executive functioning. So yeah, please call or text us, visit the website. If you have any other questions, you can follow us on social media, and yeah, we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much for attending.